Some songs don't just echo through time. They hunt for the people who need to hear them most. Claire Dawson, a 28-year-old waitress drowning in medical bills from her mother's advanced stage cancer treatment, understood survival in a way most people only glimpsed in their nightmares. The number $340,000 lived in her mind like a parasite, growing larger with each passing day, feeding on interest rates and late payment penalties. She worked the evening shift at the Riverside Diner in Portland, Oregon, where the scent of fresh-baked apple pie fought a losing battle against the sharp tang of industrial floor cleaner. The aroma of survival, she called it, that peculiar mixture of hope and desperation that clung to every surface in establishments like this. Outside the smudged windows, the Willamette River reflected the burnt orange glow of sunset, its waters moving with the same indifferent rhythm as the bills that arrived in her mailbox each morning. Claire's feet ached in shoes held together by superglue and determination, the kind of pain that became white noise after the first 6 hours of a shift. But her voice remained her one untouchable treasure, the single inheritance from her grandmother that couldn't be repossessed or tallied on a collection spreadsheet. She hummed while she worked, old folk songs her grandmother taught her before dementia stole the woman's memories, leaving only fragments of melody behind like breadcrumbs in a forest that grew darker each day. Malcolm Pierce, a 72-year-old real estate billionaire insulated from the world by layers of assistants, security personnel, and the invisible fortress that wealth constructs around a person's soul, sat alone in booth 7. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than Claire earned in 6 months. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist caught the diner's fluorescent lighting, throwing tiny prisms across the laminated menu he wasn't reading, had never read, would never need to read. He came to this diner once a month, always alone, always ordering the same thing, always leaving a decent but not extravagant tip. The staff whispered theories during cigarette breaks and shift changes, but nobody knew why a man who owned half the downtown skyline ate meatloaf in a place where the silverware didn't match and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. This isn't a fairy tale about a generous billionaire rescuing a struggling waitress. This is the story of how a forgotten lullaby shattered a man's carefully constructed fortress and revealed a wound that had been bleeding in secret for 47 years. Claire approached booth 7 with Malcolm's black coffee and pecan pie, her usual efficient smile in place, when she began to hum. The melody came without thought, rising from that deep place where her grandmother's voice still lived, an old Appalachian lullaby about a mockingbird and a broken promise. Malcolm Pierce's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The color drained from his face like someone had opened a valve. Then the billionaire began to cry, and in a voice scraped raw by decades of silence, he whispered the question that would change everything. "Where did you learn that song?" The coffee pot trembled in Claire's hand, sending tiny ripples across the dark surface. Malcolm Pierce stared at her with an intensity that made the fluorescent lights seem to brighten, made the ambient noise of the diner fade into a distant hum. His tears carved paths through the careful composure of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of emotional restraint. "My grandmother," Claire managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rose Dawson. She taught me that song when I was little, before the dementia took her memories." The words felt inadequate, like trying to explain color to someone who'd only ever seen in black and white. "She's in a memory care facility now in Beaverton. Most days she doesn't even remember my name, but sometimes she still hums that melody." Malcolm's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white against the fake wood grain. "The third verse," he said, his voice raw and urgent. "Does your grandmother sing it with the extra line? About the mockingbird building its nest in the willow tree instead of the oak." Claire's blood went cold. The diner suddenly felt too small, too hot, the air too thick to breathe properly. "Yes," she whispered. "How did you know that?" "My grandmother always said her mother changed that line, that it was special to our family." Malcolm reached for his wallet with shaking hands, the expensive leather worn soft from decades of carrying the same burden. He pulled out a photograph, its edges soft and rounded from countless touches, the colors faded to the sepia tones of memory. "My daughter," he said, and the two words contained universes of pain. "Emily Pierce." She vanished on July 23, 1978, during a camping trip near Mount Hood. She was 8 years old. The photograph showed a little girl with dark curls that caught the sunlight, hazel eyes bright with the kind of joy that exists before the world teaches you about loss. She wore a yellow sundress and held a stuffed mockingbird, and something about her smile made Claire's chest tighten. That song, Malcolm continued, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph like a prayer, was her nightly ritual. My wife Sarah taught it to her. Sarah's mother taught it to her. It was passed down through 4 generations of women in Sarah's family, each one changing that third verse slightly, making it their own. The version about the willow tree belonged only to us, only to our family. The impossibility of it crashed over Claire like a wave. She set the coffee pot down before she could drop it, her mind racing through explanations that all dissolved before they could form completely. That's not possible, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were meaningless. The evidence stood before her, a billionaire in tears, a faded photograph, and a song that shouldn't exist in 2 places at once. Around them, the diner had fallen into an eerie silence. Frank had stopped his cursing at the grill. The register's familiar chime had ceased. Other patrons stared openly now, witnessing something they didn't understand but recognized as profound. Betty, the other evening waitress, stood frozen near the counter, her order pad forgotten in her hand. Malcolm's gaze never left Claire's face, searching for answers in her features, in the curve of her jaw, in the exact shade of her eyes. You look nothing like her, he said finally, a statement that carried both relief and confusion. But that song, that exact variation, it died with my wife 15 years ago. Emily took it with her when she disappeared. There's no recording, no written lyrics. It existed only in the voices of the women who sang it. Claire's legs felt unsteady. She slid into the booth across from Malcolm without asking permission, something she'd never done with a customer in 3 years of working at the Riverside Diner. My grandmother is 79 years old, she said, her voice gaining strength as she defended the woman who'd raised her when her own father had walked away. She's lived in Portland since 1967. She was a seamstress, a mother, a woman who never hurt anyone. Whatever connection you think exists, it's a coincidence. It has to be. But even as Claire spoke the words, she watched Malcolm's tears continue to fall, and she heard the echo of her grandmother's voice humming that melody in the quiet moments before the dementia claimed her completely. And she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach twist, that coincidence was a word people used when they weren't ready to face the truth. Malcolm's grief transformed before Claire's eyes, shifting like a storm cloud catching different light. The sorrow that had broken through his billionaire's armor hardened into something sharper, more dangerous. His tears stopped, but his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that felt like being pinned under a microscope. How? The single word carried the weight of 47 years. How does a 79-year-old seamstress in Portland know a song that my wife's family guarded like a secret? A song that vanished from this world with my daughter. Claire felt her own defensiveness rising, that familiar heat that came from a lifetime of being dismissed, of having her family's integrity questioned by people who measured worth in bank balances. My grandmother learned it from her mother, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Rose Harper before she married. She grew up in West Virginia, in the coal mining towns. That's where the song came from. Her mother sang it, and her mother before that. West Virginia. Malcolm's eyes narrowed, and Claire watched him process this information with the calculating precision of a man who'd built an empire on reading patterns others missed. My wife Sarah grew up in Beckley, West Virginia. She left in 1968. His voice dropped lower, more controlled, more terrifying than his earlier emotional breakdown. Your grandmother knew my wife. She had to. This wasn't some folk song passed around like a recipe. This was family. This was ours. The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke. Around the diner, patrons had started to whisper, their voices creating a low buzz that made Claire's skin crawl. She was acutely aware of how this looked, a working-class waitress confronted by a man whose net worth could probably buy the entire block, tears and accusations flying across a vinyl booth while the meatloaf got cold. "You don't know what you're talking about," Claire said, but her voice wavered. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory stirred. Her grandmother, in one of her last lucid moments, saying something about mountains and secrets that should stay buried. Claire had dismissed it as dementia speaking, the random firing of neurons in a deteriorating brain. Malcolm leaned forward, and the gesture carried menace despite his age. "Your grandmother knew something about Emily's disappearance. She had to. The song proves it. Maybe she saw something. Maybe she knew the people involved. Or maybe," his voice broke again, but this time with rage instead of sorrow, "maybe she was involved." "How dare you?" Claire stood so abruptly the table shook, coffee sloshing over the rim of Malcolm's cup. The class divide between them crystallized in that moment, became visible like a fault line running through the center of the diner. His $12,000 suit against her grease-stained apron. His penthouse overlooking the city against her studio apartment with mold in the bathroom. His certainty that money bought truth against her knowledge that the poor were always guilty until proven innocent. "My grandmother is a good woman," Claire said, her voice rising enough that Frank poked his head out from the kitchen. "She worked her fingers raw in sweatshops so my mother could have a better life. She never hurt anyone. And I won't let you destroy her memory because you're desperate for answers." Malcolm pulled out his phone, the gesture casual but loaded with threat. "I have investigators," he said quietly. "The best money can buy. They'll dig through every year of your grandmother's life. Every job, every address, every person she ever knew. If there's a connection to my daughter's disappearance, I will find it." He stood, towering over the booth despite his age, and pulled out his wallet. He dropped $500 bills on the table, the gesture simultaneously generous and insulting. "For your time," he said, "and for what's coming." Claire stared at the money like it was poisoned. "I don't want your money." "Everyone wants my money," Malcolm replied, and the bitterness in his voice could have curdled milk. "It's the only thing I have left to offer. But if your grandmother had anything to do with Emily's disappearance, if she knows anything about what happened to my daughter, no amount of money will protect her. Or you." Claire's hands clenched into fists. "Then investigate. Dig through our entire lives. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. My grandmother is innocent." "Then prove it," Malcolm said. He placed a business card next to the $100 bills. "Work with me. Help me understand how she knows that song. Because right now, she's the only living connection I have to my daughter, and I will follow that thread wherever it leads." He walked out the diner, leaving behind the smell of expensive cologne and the wreckage of Claire's ordinary evening. She looked down at the business card, at the money she desperately needed but couldn't bring herself to touch, and felt her life crack open like an egg. The shift ended at 11, but Claire's hands still shook as she pushed through the diner's back door into the parking lot. The night air carried the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and something rotting in the dumpster behind Giuseppe's Italian restaurant next door. She sat in her 2009 Honda Civic for 10 minutes before she could trust herself to drive, Malcolm Pierce's business card burning a hole in her apron pocket alongside the $500 she'd eventually taken because rent was due and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Providence Portland Medical Center blazed with lights against the midnight sky, a fortress of fluorescent hope and crushing debt. Claire had the route from the parking garage to the ICU memorized in her bones, could walk it blindfolded, counting the exact number of steps between the elevator and her mother's room. 247 steps. She'd counted them so many times they'd become a meditation, a prayer to gods who didn't answer. Linda Dawson lay in room 412, her body diminished by the cancer that had colonized her lungs with the efficiency of an invading army. At 53, she looked 70, her skin the color of old paper, her breathing assisted by machines that beeped their expensive rhythm into the darkness. The ventilator hissed and sighed, a mechanical companion that cost more per day than Claire earned in a week. Claire held her mother's hand, careful to avoid the 4 line, and felt the fragility of bones that had once carried a child on strong shoulders, that had worked double shifts at the call center to keep the lights on. On the bedside table, partially hidden under a get-well card from Linda's church group, sat the letter from the insurance company. Claim denied. Experimental treatment not covered. Appeal rejected. The words were corporate speak for, "Your mother will die, because we'd rather spend money on executive bonuses than save her life." $340,000. The number had become Claire's constant companion, her unwelcome third shift. She worked at the Riverside Diner, cleaned houses on weekends, and did data entry remotely during the hours when most people slept. 3 jobs, and she was still drowning, still watching the debt accumulate faster than she could earn. The bitter irony sat in her stomach like spoiled food. She'd spent the evening serving a man who could write a check for her mother's treatment without noticing the dent in his bank balance, a man who probably spent more on his watch than Claire would earn in 5 years. And he thought her family were criminals. Thought her grandmother, who'd darned socks until her fingers bled, who'd made soup from bones and vegetables other people threw away, had somehow been involved in a child's disappearance. Claire left the hospital at 1 in the morning and drove through empty streets to Maplewood Memory Care in Beaverton. The night staff knew her, waved her through with sympathetic smiles that made her want to scream. She found her grandmother in the common room, awake despite the hour, staring at a television that wasn't turned on. Rose Dawson had been beautiful once. Claire had seen the photographs, black and white images of a young woman with dark hair and defiant eyes, someone who'd escaped the coal mines of West Virginia for the promise of the West Coast. Now she was a ghost wearing her grandmother's face, eyes that looked through Claire more than at her, hands that plucked at the blanket in her lap with desperate confusion. "Grandma Rose," Claire said softly, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "I need to ask you about the song. The one you taught me. About the mockingbird." For a moment, nothing. Rose's eyes remained fixed on the blank television screen, her mouth working soundlessly. Then something shifted, like clouds parting briefly to let through sunlight. Her gaze sharpened, focused on Claire with a clarity that had been absent for months. Rose began to hum. The melody filled the quiet room, pure and perfect, exactly as Claire remembered from childhood. The Appalachian lullaby, complete with the third verse about the willow tree, the variation that supposedly belonged only to Malcolm Pierce's lost family. "Grandma," Claire whispered, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Where did you learn that song? Did you know a woman named Sarah? Sarah Mitchell from Beckley?" Rose's humming stopped. Her eyes locked onto Claire's with an intensity that was almost frightening. A drowning woman breaking the surface for one desperate breath. "The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides," she whispered, her voice papery and thin, but absolutely certain. "The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides." What does that mean? Claire gripped her grandmother's hands, but already the lucidity was fading. Rose's eyes clouded over, the brief window closing as quickly as it had opened. "Grandma, please. What mountain? What are you talking about?" But Rose was gone again, lost in a fog that consumed more of her mind each day. She returned to staring at the blank television, humming a different song now, something from the 1950s that Claire didn't recognize. Claire sat on the floor beside her grandmother's wheelchair, Malcolm Pierce's business card crumpled in her fist, and felt the weight of secrets she didn't understand pressing down on her shoulders. "The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides." The words repeated in her mind like a riddle, like a warning, like a confession waiting to be heard. Malcolm Pierce's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, Portland's most expensive address, where windows framed the city like living photographs and silence cost extra. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking down at the lights spreading below him like a circuit board, and felt the familiar emptiness that no amount of square footage could fill. The penthouse was a monument to a man who'd spent 47 years building monuments. Awards lined the walls, photographs of Malcolm shaking hands with governors and presidents, newspaper clippings trumpeting his latest development deal. But in his private study, hidden behind a door that stayed locked even when cleaning crews came through, was a room that told the truth about who Malcolm Pierce really was. The walls were covered in photographs of Emily. Emily, as an infant, wrinkled and red-faced and perfect. Emily at 2, covered in spaghetti sauce and laughing. Emily at 5, missing her front teeth, holding up a drawing she'd made at school. Emily at 8, the last photographs, taken just hours before she vanished into the Cascade Mountains and never returned. Malcolm poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, expensive enough that it should have tasted like something other than regret, and let himself remember what he'd spent decades trying to forget. July 1978. Malcolm had been 25 years old, young enough to think he knew everything, successful enough to prove it. He'd just closed his first major commercial real estate deal, and he decided to celebrate by taking his family camping. His wife, Sarah, had been reluctant. She preferred hotels, room service, beds that didn't require sleeping bags. But 8-year-old Emily had begged, and Malcolm had insisted. This would be bonding time, quality family memories. They'd chosen a campground near Mount Hood, one of those places that promised wilderness, while still offering flush toilets and designated fire pits. Sarah had brought too many supplies, overpacking the way she always did. Emily had brought her stuffed mockingbird, the one her grandmother had made, and her endless enthusiasm for everything the forest offered. The last night they'd sat around the campfire. Malcolm remembered the smell of burning wood, the particular cold that crept in after sunset in the mountains, the way stars looked when you got away from city lights. Emily had sung her lullaby, the one Sarah's mother had taught her, about the mockingbird building its nest. Her voice had been thin and sweet, slightly off-key in the way that children's voices are, precious because they're imperfect. Malcolm remembered kissing her goodnight, remembered Sarah tucking her into the small tent they'd set up beside their own, remembered falling asleep to the sound of the forest settling around them, secure in the knowledge that his daughter was safe, that his family was intact, that the world made sense. Morning had shattered that certainty like glass. Emily's tent was empty, her sleeping bag still zipped closed from the inside, which was impossible. The stuffed mockingbird lay abandoned on her pillow. She was simply gone, as if the forest had opened up and swallowed her whole. The search had been massive. Park rangers, volunteers, FBI agents, search dogs, helicopters. Malcolm had thrown money at the problem the way he threw money at everything, hiring private investigators, offering rewards that escalated from thousands to hundreds of thousands. The story made national news. Missing girl, wealthy family, mysterious disappearance. The media had feasted on it. And then the whispers had started. The investigators looking at Malcolm differently. The questions about his relationship with his daughter, about his marriage, about whether he'd taken out life insurance policies. The suspicion that maybe the grieving father was actually a murderer, that maybe this camping trip had been planned for darker purposes. The investigation cleared him, eventually, but it destroyed his marriage just as effectively as if he'd been guilty. Sarah couldn't look at him without seeing the accusations, couldn't sleep beside him without wondering if the investigators had been right. She moved out 6 months after Emily vanished, filed for divorce a year later, died 5 years after that, her heart giving out at 42, a medical impossibility that made perfect sense to anyone who understood that some wounds were fatal even when they didn't bleed. Malcolm had built his empire in the aftermath, constructing towers that pierced the sky as if height could compensate for depth. He funded missing children's organizations, established scholarships, put his name on hospitals and schools. He did everything money could do, and it meant nothing. Emily remained gone. The case remained cold. The wound remained open. 47 years. Malcolm had lived longer without his daughter than many people lived in total. He'd become an old man waiting for answers that never came, for closure that stayed perpetually out of reach. He'd made peace with never knowing, or so he'd told himself. And then a waitress in a diner had hummed a melody that only his daughter should have known, and the wound had torn open again, fresh and bleeding as if no time had passed at all. Malcolm looked at his reflection in the penthouse window, at the ghost of himself superimposed over the city lights, and knew that he would follow this thread wherever it led, even if it destroyed him, even if the truth was worse than 47 years of not knowing, because Emily deserved that much. And because Malcolm Pierce had built an empire but never built peace. Claire was refilling salt shakers during the mid-morning lull when Malcolm Pierce walked back into the Riverside Diner. 24 hours had passed since their confrontation, 24 hours during which Claire had slept maybe 3 hours total, her mind chasing her grandmother's cryptic words through the labyrinth of her own exhaustion. Malcolm looked different in daylight, still expensive, still carrying himself with the posture of a man accustomed to deference, but something had shifted in his bearing. The rage from the previous night had cooled into something more dangerous, determination tempered by desperation. "We need to talk," he said, sliding into booth 7 as if he owned it, which, Claire reflected bitterly, he probably could if he wanted to. "My investigator found something." Claire set down the salt shaker with deliberate care, aware of Betty watching from behind the counter, of Frank's curious glance from the kitchen window. "I'm working. I'll buy your time." Malcolm pulled out his phone, brought up a photograph, and turned the screen toward her. "This is from the Beckley High School yearbook, 1965. The image showed rows of teenage faces, that particular quality of old yearbook photos, where everyone looked simultaneously young and ancient. Malcolm zoomed in on 2 girls in the second row. The caption read, "Rose Harper and Sarah Mitchell." Claire's stomach dropped. Her grandmother, young and smiling, stood next to a girl who could have been her sister. Both had dark hair. Both wore the same style of cardigan. Both looked at the camera with the guarded optimism of teenagers who didn't yet know what the world would take from them. They were classmates, Malcolm said, his voice carefully controlled. More than that, historical records show both families lived on Maple Street in Beckley, 3 houses apart. Rose Harper and Sarah Mitchell grew up together, went to the same school, sang in the same church choir. The world tilted slightly. Claire gripped the edge of the table, needing something solid to hold on to. "That doesn't mean." Rose married in 1967, moved to Portland that same year. Malcolm continued, reading from his phone. "Sarah moved to Seattle in 1968. We met at a real estate investment seminar in 1970. Married in 1971. Emily was born in 1970. He looked up, his ice blue eyes boring into Claire's. "Your grandmother never mentioned knowing my wife. Not when Emily disappeared. Not when the story was national news. Not when every news outlet in the country was showing Sarah's photograph." Claire wanted to argue, wanted to defend Rose against the implications hanging in the air like smoke. But the evidence stared back at her from Malcolm's phone screen. 2 girls who'd been friends, who'd lived 3 houses apart, who'd somehow ended up on opposite sides of a tragedy that had defined both their families. "There's more," Malcolm said. He swiped to another document, this one an official-looking form with an FBI header. Rose Dawson was interviewed by police in 1978 during the broad witness canvassing. Standard procedure. They talked to everyone in the Portland area with any connection to our family. She told investigators she didn't know us. She lied to the FBI. The words hit Claire like physical blows. Maybe she forgot. Maybe with everything that happened. Nobody forgets their childhood best friend's daughter going missing. Malcolm's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the emotion he was trying to hold back. "I need to know why she lied. I need to know what she knows about Emily." Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes, hot and unwelcome. The salt shaker collection sat forgotten on the table between them. Ordinary objects in an increasingly extraordinary situation. "My grandmother has dementia. Whatever she knew, whatever she remembers, it's locked inside a mind that's falling apart piece by piece." "Then help me find another way," Malcolm said. He pulled out a manila folder, set it on the table with the care of someone handling explosives. "This is a contract. I'll cover your mother's medical expenses. All $340,000. I'll pay for the experimental treatment her insurance denied. I'll hire the best oncology team on the West Coast. In exchange, you work with me, full-time. We investigate your grandmother's past together. We find out why she lied, what she knows, and what happened to my daughter." Claire stared at the folder like it might bite her. "You're offering to save my mother's life in exchange for potentially destroying my grandmother's memory." "I'm offering to find the truth," Malcolm corrected. Whatever that truth is. I'm not interested in revenge, Claire. I'm interested in answers. In justice. In finally being able to lay my daughter to rest, one way or another. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Claire. She'd spent the last year working 3 jobs, sacrificing sleep and health and any semblance of a normal life, trying to save her mother through sheer determination. And here sat a man who could solve her problem with a signature, who could give her mother a fighting chance at survival, asking only that Claire help him excavate a past that her own family had apparently worked hard to bury. If we do this, Claire said slowly, we pursue the truth. Not your version of it. Not what you want to hear. The actual truth, even if it's not what either of us expects. Malcolm extended his hand across the table. The actual truth, he agreed. Even if it destroys us both. Claire looked at his hand, at the liver spots and expensive watch, at the physical representation of a bargain that would bind her fate to his. She thought of her mother dying slowly in the ICU. She thought of her grandmother humming that melody in the memory care facility. She thought of an 8-year-old girl who'd vanished 47 years ago and never came home. She shook his hand and felt her life crack open even wider, felt herself stepping across a threshold she couldn't uncross. Their quest for truth was now inextricably linked. 2 families bound together by song, a lie, and a mystery that had been waiting 47 years to be solved. David Chun was not what Claire expected. Malcolm's private investigator looked more like a college professor than the noir detective of Hollywood imagination. He wore glasses that constantly slid down his nose, favored cardigan sweaters over leather jackets, and had the demeanor of someone who found missing pieces in puzzles for the sheer intellectual satisfaction rather than the paycheck. They met in Malcolm's downtown office, a space that occupied an entire floor of one of his buildings, where the view stretched from Mount Hood to the Pacific Ocean on clear days. Today, low clouds obscured everything, turning Portland into an island floating in gray mist. I've been working on this for 18 hours straight, David said, spreading documents across Malcolm's conference table like a dealer laying out cards. And what I found is both exactly what we expected and absolutely impossible. He pulled up the first piece of evidence on the large screen that dominated one wall. The Beckley High School yearbook again, but this time David had compiled multiple pages. Rose Harper and Sarah Mitchell appeared in nearly every group photograph. The debate team, the choir, the drama club. They'd been inseparable. Historical records confirm what the yearbook suggests, David continued, pushing his glasses up with one finger. Both families lived on Maple Street. The Harpers at 412, the Mitchells at 418. 6 houses apart, not 3 as I initially reported. Rose's father worked in the mines. Sarah's father managed the company store. Different social classes, but in a town that's small, those distinctions mattered less than they might have elsewhere. Claire studied the photographs, seeing her grandmother's young face repeated across different contexts, different years. Rose Harper had been pretty, with a defiant tilt to her chin that suggested she'd been planning her escape from Beckley long before she actually left. Rose married Jacob Dawson in June 1967, David said, pulling up a marriage certificate. He was a merchant marine, based out of Portland. They moved west that August. Sarah Mitchell left Beckley in March 1968, moved to Seattle to attend business school. The connection between them ended there, at least on paper. Malcolm leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. But, David agreed, the song complicates everything. I consulted with Dr. Patricia Morrison, an ethnomusicologist at Reed College who specializes in Appalachian folk traditions. She listened to the recording you made of Claire's grandmother humming the melody. Claire flinched. She'd forgotten Malcolm had recorded Rose during one of their visits to Maplewood Memory Care, had felt betrayed when she discovered the recording existed. But she'd agreed to this investigation, agreed to follow the truth wherever it led. David played the audio file. Rose's thin, wavering voice filled the conference room, singing about mockingbirds and willow trees, the melody haunting in its simplicity. When it ended, David pulled up a document on the screen. Dr. Morrison's analysis confirms this is an extremely rare Appalachian variant of a much older British folk song, he said. The original version, dating back to the 1600s, was about faithfulness and broken promises. But this specific variation, with the willow tree verse, appears in only one documented source. He clicked to the next slide. A photograph of a woman, elderly and fierce-looking, standing in front of a coal mining camp. The caption read, Iris Harper, 1923. Iris Harper was Rose's great-grandmother and Sarah Mitchell's great-grandmother, David said. They were second cousins, though neither family seems to have made much of the connection. Iris was known in the coal camps for her singing. This lullaby was her signature piece, taught only to family members. Dr. Morrison found a recording made in 1948 by folklorists documenting Appalachian music traditions. The willow tree verse is identical to what Rose sang. The pieces clicked together in Claire's mind, forming a picture that explained everything and nothing. So they learned the song from the same source, from Iris. That's why they both knew it, why Emily knew it. Yes, David said, which explains the how. But it makes the why even more troubling. Malcolm's voice was soft, dangerous. Why Rose lied? Exactly. David pulled up another document. This one, an FBI report from 1978. Claire recognized her grandmother's name in the header, felt her stomach clench. During the investigation into Emily's disappearance, agents interviewed everyone with even a tangential connection to the Pierce family. Rose Dawson came up because she'd sent a condolence card to Sarah. Just a standard sympathy card purchased from a drugstore, signed, with deepest sympathy, Rose. Sarah kept it? Claire asked. Malcolm nodded, his expression unreadable. She kept everything related to Emily. Every card, every letter, every newspaper clipping. After she died, I inherited boxes of it. The card was in there. No return address, but it had a Portland postmark. David highlighted a section of the FBI report. When agents questioned Rose about the card, about her relationship with Sarah Pierce, she said, and I quote, I didn't know the family personally. I just saw the news and wanted to express sympathy. I never met Mrs. Pierce or her daughter. End quote. The lie sat in the conference room like a third person, impossible to ignore. Claire felt her grandmother's deception like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Rose had denied knowing Sarah, had denied their shared childhood, their friendship, their family connection, had lied to federal investigators during a missing child case. Why? Claire whispered. Why would she lie? David Chin looked at her with something like sympathy. That, he said, is what we need to find out. Claire's mother was having a good day, which meant she was conscious and able to speak in short sentences between breaths. The experimental treatment had begun 2 days ago, Malcolm's money working its particular magic, transforming impossible into merely difficult. The oncology team Malcolm hired spoke in cautious optimism, a language Claire had learned to distrust, but couldn't help hoping in any way. Tell me about Grandma Rose, Claire said, pulling a chair close to her mother's bed. Tell me about when you were little, about West Virginia. Linda Dawson's eyes, sunken in her gaunt face, studied her daughter with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. Why are you asking about this now? Please, Mom. Linda was quiet for a long moment, the ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, the monitors beeping their mathematical proof of life. We left West Virginia when I was 3, she finally said. I don't remember much. The house smelled like coal dust. That's what I remember most. Everything smelled like coal dust, like it had worked its way into the walls, into our skin. Did Grandma Rose ever talk about her life there? About friends she had? Something shifted in Linda's expression, a door closing. Your grandmother didn't like to talk about the past. She said the past was a place people went to hide from the present. Claire leaned forward. Mom, did she ever mention knowing someone named Sarah? Sarah Mitchell, who later became Sarah Pierce. The monitors showed Linda's heart rate increasing, subtle but measurable. Where did you hear that name? Answer the question, please. Linda's fingers plucked at the hospital blanket, the same nervous gesture Rose displayed in her wheelchair. Before she got sick, Linda said slowly, before the dementia, your grandmother made me promise something. Made the whole family promise. We were never to talk about what happened in the mountains. never to speak about it, never to ask questions, never to go digging in the past. Claire's blood went cold. What happened in the mountains? I don't know. Linda's voice rose, triggering an alarm on one of the machines. A nurse appeared in the doorway, concerned, but Linda waved her away. I don't know, because we kept our promise. We didn't ask, but I know she had nightmares. For years, she would wake up screaming about mockingbirds and mountain ridges and being buried alive. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture Claire didn't want to see. When did the nightmares start? Linda met her daughter's eyes, and in that moment, Claire saw that her mother knew more than she was saying, had always known, had chosen silence over truth. 1978, Linda whispered. The nightmares started in 1978, the same summer that little girl disappeared. The revelation hit Claire like a physical blow. She stood, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. You knew Grandma Rose was connected to Emily Pierce's disappearance, and you never said anything. I knew my mother was having nightmares. Linda's voice was stronger than it had been in weeks, fueled by desperation or fear or both. I knew she was terrified of something, but she begged us not to ask, not to dig, not to destroy what little peace she had. So we didn't. We protected her. A child was missing, Claire said, her voice shaking. A family was destroyed, and your entire family chose silence. We chose to protect our own. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Maybe that makes us terrible people. Maybe we should have forced her to tell us what she knew. But she was my mother, and she was suffering, and I chose her. I would make the same choice again. Claire walked out of the hospital room, walked past the nurse's station, walked until she found herself in the stairwell, where she'd cried so many times over the past year. She called Malcolm, her hands shaking so badly she almost couldn't dial. My mother knew, she said when he answered. Not the details, but she knew Rose was connected to Emily's disappearance. The whole family knew something happened, and they all chose to stay silent. Malcolm's voice was carefully controlled. David found something else. Rose's older brother, Thomas Harper. He worked as a groundskeeper at the Timberline campground, the same campground where Emily disappeared. The stairwell seemed to tilt. Claire sat down hard on the concrete steps, the cold seeping through her jeans. No, he was interviewed by police in 1978. Said he'd seen nothing unusual, noticed nothing suspicious. But David dug deeper. Thomas Harper died in 1982, apparent suicide. He drove his truck off a logging road near Mount Hood, blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. You think he was involved? I think he knew something. And I think whatever he knew, he told Rose. And I think Rose has been carrying that secret for 47 years, until her mind started to unravel, and the truth began leaking out in cryptic warnings and midnight screams. Claire pressed her forehead against her knees, trying to breathe through the weight crushing her chest. The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides. She wasn't being cryptic. She was being literal. There's something hidden in the mountains. Something about Emily. David is running geological surveys of the area around Mockingbird Ridge, Malcolm said. It's a remote section near Mount Hood, about 15 miles from where Emily disappeared. If there's something there, we'll find it. But even as he spoke, Claire knew they'd already found the truth. It was just a matter of proving it, of excavating the secret that had been buried for 47 years, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig it up. Richard Caldwell had the kind of face that belonged on recruiting posters, all noble jaw and honest eyes, the physical embodiment of duty and honor. At 74, he'd been retired from the Portland Police Bureau for 12 years, but he still carried himself like a cop, still spoke in that particular cadence that suggested authority and trustworthiness. He'd been helping them from the beginning, or so Claire had thought, offering insights into the original investigation, providing access to old case files, being generally supportive and grandfatherly in his concern for Malcolm's decades-old wound. They met him at a coffee shop in Northwest Portland, the kind of place where retired professionals spent their mornings reading newspapers and complaining about whoever was in office. Caldwell ordered a black coffee and a blueberry scone, the picture of a man comfortable with himself and his past. "I've been thinking about your theory," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with meticulous care. "About Thomas Harper. I remember interviewing him in '78. Seemed like a decent guy. Bit rough around the edges, but the groundskeeper type usually are. Didn't strike me as someone who'd hurt a child." Malcolm leaned forward. "But you think he knew something?" "Everyone knew something," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the weight of professional experience. "That's the problem with these cases. You interview 100 people, they all saw something, heard something, noticed something. 99 of them are dead ends. The trick is figuring out which one actually matters." David Chun had been quiet during the exchange, his laptop open, but his attention focused on Caldwell with an intensity that made Claire nervous. "Detective Caldwell," he said now, "can you tell me about the property you own near Mockingbird Ridge?" The coffee shop seemed to go very quiet. Caldwell's hand froze halfway to his mouth with the scone. "Excuse me. Property records show you purchased 40 acres near Mockingbird Ridge in 1979, David continued, his voice pleasant, conversational, deadly. "1 year after Emily Pierce disappeared. You sold it in 1995 for a substantial profit. I'm curious why a Portland police detective would invest in remote mountain property so soon after working a case in that area." Caldwell set down the scone very carefully. "That's public record. Nothing sinister about it. I bought land as an investment. Lots of people do." "Absolutely," David agreed. "But here's what's interesting. Thomas Harper worked at the Timberline campground. You investigated Emily Pierce's disappearance. And you both had connections to Mockingbird Ridge. Harper's body was found on a logging road just 3 miles from your property line." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Claire watched Caldwell's face, saw the micro-expressions that flickered across his features, the calculation of a man deciding how much to reveal, how much to protect. "You're making connections that don't exist," Caldwell said, but his voice had changed, become harder, more defensive. "I was a good cop. I worked that case for years. I never stopped trying to find out what happened to Emily." "Or," Malcolm said quietly, "you never stopped making sure no one else would find out." Caldwell stood abruptly, his chair scraping harsh against the floor. Other patrons looked up, startled. "I don't have to listen to this. I came here to help, and you're accusing me of—" "What exactly?" "Covering up a child's murder." "I'm saying," Malcolm stood as well, and despite being several inches shorter than Caldwell, he somehow dominated the space, "that your property ownership, your connection to Thomas Harper, and your position as the lead investigator create a pattern that's hard to ignore." "Then investigate it," Caldwell said. "Run all the background checks you want. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. I'm done here." He walked out of the coffee shop, moving with the stiff dignity of a man who'd been deeply insulted. But Claire had seen something in his eyes before he turned away. Not anger, fear. David closed his laptop with a soft click. "He's lying." "About what?" Claire asked. "Everything." David pulled up a file on his phone, showed it to them. "I had a forensic linguist analyze the original case files, looking at patterns in how different witnesses were questioned. Caldwell's interviews with Thomas Harper were notably brief. 3 pages when the average interview ran 10 to 15. And he never followed up, never pushed back on Harper's answers, never questioned inconsistencies. He protected him," Malcolm said, his voice hollow. "More than that." David swiped to another document. "I had a specialist examine the property transaction. Caldwell paid $45,000 for 40 acres in 1979. That's well above market value for remote mountain property at the time. The seller." He paused for effect. "A shell corporation that dissolved in 1981. But the corporation's registered agent was listed as T. Harper." The conspiracy crystallized in that moment, became solid and real. Thomas Harper had sold Caldwell the property, taking payment that was actually a bribe, money exchanged for silence, for protection, for looking the other way. "Harper found Emily," Claire said, the pieces finally falling into place. He panicked, called someone he thought he could trust. Rose, his sister. But Rose didn't know what to do, so she called someone else. Someone with authority. Someone who could make the problem disappear. Caldwell, Malcolm finished. She called Detective Richard Caldwell. And instead of doing his job, instead of saving my daughter, he saw an opportunity, a chance to make money, to advance his career by being the dedicated detective who never gave up on the Pierce case. All he had to do was make sure Emily stayed missing. David nodded grimly. And when Harper's guilt became too much, when he started drinking, started talking, started becoming a liability. He died in a convenient accident, Malcolm said. Drunk driving, single vehicle collision. Case closed, investigation brief. Who investigated Harper's death? David pulled up another file. The lead detective was Richard Caldwell. The coffee shop sounds had faded to background noise. Claire stared at the table, at the coffee rings and crumbs, at the ordinary debris of an ordinary morning that had just revealed something monstrous. "We need proof," she said. "Hard evidence. Not just connections and suspicions." "Mockingbird Ridge," Malcolm said. "If Emily's there, if Harper and Caldwell buried her there, that's our proof." David was already on his phone, making calls, arranging things. "I'll have ground-penetrating radar equipment ready by tomorrow. We'll need the county sheriff involved, proper chain of custody for any evidence we find." Claire thought about her grandmother, screaming in her sleep about being buried alive, about mockingbirds and mountains. Rose had known, had carried the knowledge for 47 years, had tried to protect her brother, had been manipulated by a corrupt cop, had chosen silence over truth and let that choice destroy her mind piece by piece. "When we find Emily," Claire said, looking at Malcolm, seeing the mixture of hope and dread in his eyes, "when we prove what Caldwell did, it's going to destroy a lot of people. Your family, mine, everyone who's been living in the shadow of this lie." Malcolm met her gaze, steady and certain. "Then let it be destroyed. Truth is the only foundation worth building on. Everything else is just another kind of grave." The ground-penetrating radar found her on a cold October morning, 47 years and 3 months after she'd disappeared. Emily Pierce lay beneath 6 feet of earth and pine needles on Mockingbird Ridge, her small skeleton curled in a position that suggested she'd been sleeping when death came. The forensic team worked with reverent efficiency, documenting everything, treating the excavation like the sacred act it was. Malcolm stood at the perimeter, watching them uncover his daughter, and felt something in his chest finally release. Not relief, not peace, but the terrible certainty that comes with knowing, with having proof that transforms hope into history. Claire stood beside him, her hand finding his without thought, 2 people bound together by a song and a secret that had taken 47 years to surface. The evidence they'd gathered sat in David Chen's possession, meticulously documented, ready to be used. "Tonight," Malcolm said, his voice scraped raw. "We end this tonight." The Portland Police Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, a black tie affair where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their charitable giving while consuming prime rib and expensive wine. Richard Caldwell was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award, his decades of service to the Bureau immortalized in a crystal trophy and a plaque that would hang in the headquarters lobby. Malcolm Pierce had bought a table, had ensured his name appeared on the donor list, ensuring his presence would be expected, welcomed, celebrated. But he'd also brought something else, David Chen's evidence file and a team of federal investigators who'd been quietly building a case against Caldwell for the past 2 weeks. The ballroom of the Portland Hilton blazed with chandeliers and self-satisfaction. 500 of Portland's finest citizens filled tables draped in white linen, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter expensive and hollow. On stage, the police chief was giving Caldwell's introduction, listing his accomplishments, praising his dedication to the Pierce case specifically. "Detective Caldwell never gave up," the chief said, reading from prepared remarks. "Even when the case went cold, even when others moved on, he continued to search for answers about Emily Pierce's disappearance. His commitment represents the best of what law enforcement can be." Malcolm stood, his movement drawing attention from nearby tables. He walked toward the stage with the measured pace of a man who'd been waiting 47 years for this moment. Claire followed, carrying a laptop, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone in the ballroom must hear it. "Chief Morrison," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the applause, carrying to every corner of the room. "Before you give that award, there's something everyone needs to see." Security moved toward them, but the chief held up a hand. This was Malcolm Pierce, after all, a man whose donations funded half the department's equipment upgrades. "Mr. Pierce, this isn't the time." "We found Emily," Malcolm said, and the ballroom went silent. "This morning, buried on Mockingbird Ridge, exactly where my investigation suggested she would be." Caldwell's face had gone the color of old newspaper. He stood frozen at his table, the crystal trophy forgotten in his hands. David Chun appeared from the wings with a projector setup, his movements efficient and practiced. Within seconds, images flooded the screens mounted throughout the ballroom. Ground-penetrating radar results, excavation photographs, forensic reports, and most damning, financial records showing Caldwell's property purchase from Thomas Harper's Shell Corporation. "In 1978, Malcolm continued, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest, "Thomas Harper found my daughter wandering alone after she sleepwalked from our campsite. He brought her to his sister Rose, who panicked and called someone she thought she could trust. A young detective named Richard Caldwell. The screens changed, showing telephone records from 1978, Rose Dawson's number to Caldwell's personal line. 3 calls in the early morning hours of July 23rd. But Detective Caldwell didn't see a lost child who needed help," Malcolm said, each word precisely weighted. "He saw an opportunity, a high-profile case that could make his career. All he had to do was make sure Emily stayed missing. So he helped Thomas Harper stage her disappearance, took payment in the form of undervalued property, and built a 30-year career on the reputation of being the dedicated detective who never gave up on the Pierce case." Claire's voice joined his, reading from the forensic psychiatrist's report. "Emily Pierce died accidentally during the cover-up attempt, likely from exposure and shock. She was 8 years old. Her body was buried on what is now Mockingbird Ridge, on property that Richard Caldwell owned for 16 years. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, the sound of chairs scraping as people stood. Caldwell moved toward the exit, but federal agents were already there, badges displayed, handcuffs ready. "Richard Caldwell," the lead agent said, her voice carrying the flat authority of federal law enforcement, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a death, and evidence tampering in connection with the 1978 disappearance of Emily Pierce." The crystal trophy slipped from Caldwell's hands and shattered on the ballroom floor, a sound like breaking ice, like 47 years of lies finally coming apart. He looked at Malcolm with hatred, with fear, with the desperate rage of a man whose carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. "I didn't kill her," Caldwell said, his voice barely audible. "Harper brought her to me, already dying. I just made a choice." "You made a choice," Malcolm agreed, his voice soft and terrible. "You chose your career over my daughter's life. You chose money over justice. You chose to let my family suffer for 47 years while you accepted awards and accolades for your dedication to finding her." The agents led Caldwell away, his dignity stripped as efficiently as his freedom, his legacy transformed from hero cop to corrupt monster in the span of 15 minutes. The gala dissolved into chaos, journalists already calling their editors, attendees fleeing or gawking, the careful social order of Portland's elite fragmenting like ice under a hammer. Claire found herself back at Malcolm's side, both of them standing in the eye of the storm they'd created, watching justice finally, belatedly, arrive. 3 months later, Claire stood on Mockingbird Ridge in early spring, watching workers put the final touches on Emily Pierce's memorial. The structure was simple but beautiful. A bronze mockingbird perched on a willow branch, wings spread as if in flight or song. Below it, a plaque with Emily's photograph and the dates that bookend her too short life. The trial had been swift. Caldwell's defense had crumbled under the weight of evidence David Chun had assembled. Thomas Harper's personal journals, discovered in a storage unit, detailed everything. finding Emily calling Rose, being manipulated by Caldwell into hiding the body in exchange for protection from prosecution for his prior criminal record. Rose's cryptic warnings suddenly made perfect sense. The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides. She'd been trying to confess, her deteriorating mind forcing truth through the cracks in her carefully maintained silence. Caldwell was sentenced to 40 years. He'd die in prison, his legacy destroyed, his name synonymous with corruption and betrayal. Other cases he'd worked were being reviewed, other families wondering if justice had been equally compromised. Rose Dawson had passed quietly in her sleep 2 weeks after Emily's body was found. As if her purpose had been fulfilled, her secret finally told. She'd left behind a handwritten letter, discovered in her room at Maplewood Memory Care, addressed to Malcolm Pierce, and written in the shaky hand of someone fighting dementia's tide. The letter explained everything. Her terror when Thomas had appeared with a dying child. Her desperate call to Caldwell, believing he would help. Her horror when she realized what he'd done. Her choice to stay silent, protecting her brother, protecting herself, and in doing so, causing harm that rippled across decades. Claire had read the letter to Malcolm in his penthouse, both of them crying, both understanding that guilt and innocence weren't simple categories, that good people could make terrible choices, that silence could be its own form of violence. "Your grandmother wasn't a monster," Malcolm had said afterward. "She was a scared woman who made a devastating choice. I can't forgive her, but I can understand her." Linda Dawson's cancer was in remission, the experimental treatment working better than anyone had dared hope. She'd attended Rose's funeral, weeping not just for her mother, but for all the years they'd lived in the shadow of an unspoken truth. The Emily Pierce Foundation for Missing Children opened its doors in February, funded entirely by Malcolm's wealth, focused specifically on cold cases where corruption or incompetence had derailed investigations. Claire served as its spokesperson, her face becoming familiar on news programs and podcasts, telling the story of how a song had unlocked a 47-year-old mystery. She'd quit her jobs at the diner, the cleaning service, the data entry company. Now she worked full-time helping families like Malcolm's find answers, using her experience to guide them through the impossible maze of hope and grief that came with having a missing child. The memorial ceremony drew a small crowd. Linda Dawson, still weak but alive, leaning on her daughter's arm. David Chun, who'd become a friend as well as an investigator. Representatives from missing children's organizations across the country. And Malcolm Pierce, who'd finally found his daughter and with her, a kind of peace he'd thought impossible. Claire sang the lullaby as the sun set behind Mount Hood, her voice carrying across the ridge where Emily had been found. The Appalachian melody that had started everything, the song passed down through generations of women who'd survived coal mines and poverty and choices that haunted them forever. Malcolm cried, standing beside Emily's memorial. But these tears were different. Not the desperate sobs of the diner, not the rage-filled grief of 47 years of not knowing. These were tears of release, of completion, of a story finally told in full. When the song ended, Malcolm placed his hand on the bronze mockingbird and spoke to his daughter for the first time in 47 years, knowing she could finally hear him. "I found you, baby girl. I finally found you." Claire stood beside him, this unlikely partnership forged in tragedy and truth, and understood that some songs didn't just connect people. They freed them. They brought justice. They transformed silence into testimony and guilt into grace. True wealth isn't what you inherit, she thought, watching Malcolm trace Emily's name on the plaque. True wealth is having the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful, because only truth can set you free. The mockingbird on the memorial caught the last rays of sunlight, its bronze wings glowing gold, and Claire imagined she heard it singing, that old Appalachian melody rising from the mountain that had kept it secret for 47 years. The mockingbird knows what the mountain hides, but not anymore. Not ever again. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories where truth triumphs over decades of lies. Share this with someone who needs to know that justice, even when delayed, is never truly denied. Comment below. What would you do if a song revealed a family secret?